Welcome to this short video that I call What ATC Should Do When Gear Problems Are Being Diagnosed. Just that short period of time after a pilot says they have trouble with the landing gear and they're going to go out and diagnose or try to troubleshoot the problem. What should we be doing? For the record, I'm filming this the day after Christmas of 2020. So I'm going to talk about 5 basic categories and things. I'm not going to go too much into the weeds in these areas. But then what I want to do is, after going through some of those specifics, I want to get a conversation started and have a team develop generic checklist for ATC during gear troubleshooting events. What I loosely have in mind is this. I would actually like to see somebody step up or more than one somebody step up and kind of help develop a generic checklist for us as controllers to use during gear troubleshooting events. I'm not opposed to doing the work myself. I'm lazy, but I'm not maybe that lazy. What I'm going to do is kind of toss out some ideas, hope to get a conversation started. You're free to agree or disagree. Just be prepared to defend your arguments if you're going to disagree and so on. That's fine. I'm trying to defend my arguments here. But basically the idea is if somebody says, okay, we're going to go run checklists for a little bit, just here are some kinds of things that I would like controllers to think about. And if we have a checklist that's available in eRIS or IDS and we could just pull it up very quickly, that just gives us a chance to make sure that we don't take any additional risk during this troubleshooting period. Okay, so what are the 5 basic categories of things I have in mind? One is about fuel. There are documented cases, including airliners, plural, who've run the darn things out of gas while they were distracted troubleshooting the landing gear situation. So what I would do, what I recommend, is just wait a couple of minutes. So I'm assuming that somebody's coming into land. If they're coming into land, they typically have at least an hour of fuel still in the tanks. That obviously can vary, but typically they're coming into land. They go to put the gear down and it's like, whoops, that didn't work. All right, so we're going to go around. We're going to go off and run checklists for a little while, try to see if we can figure out the problem. Occasionally it happens when somebody first takes off, they go to put the gear up and clearly there's some kind of issue with the gear. But basically, especially if we're talking about kind of the go-around situations when somebody was trying to land, just give them a couple minutes, figure out where we're going to put them while they're going to go play their troubleshooting games and so on. And then I would very politely just ask for the fuel in both the time and the amount. Okay, so for time, the pilot's going to say, oh, I got about an hour, if that's all we ask for. I actually argue that a lot of pilots are just going to kind of guess that. They're not really precise necessarily. But if we ask them for the fuel in both the exact time and the amount to their best estimate, it just forces them to stop and think about it for a second. So we're not intruding on any PIC authority. But in some situations, we might get an answer for a lot of the GA airplanes of something on the order of about 1 hour and about 20 gallons. Let's just use that for our example purposes here. Okay, wait till they give us the answers for those two, and then separately, almost like they didn't know this one's coming, ask them what is their intended minimum fuel at touchdown, again, both in time and in amount. Again, we're not intruding on PIC authority. That just forces them to kind of spit out their answer. Now, they can put out whatever answer they want. Something that might get included in the checklist is what phraseology, if any, we should use if they get below some absolute time, such as my personal minimum would be 30 minutes. For me, if somebody says, oh, I'm going to bring it down to 15 minutes of fuel, I won't argue it in detail here. I do not like any answer less than 30 minutes at touchdown. For a lot of typical GA airplanes, that's like 5 to 10 gallons. The last 5 or 10 gallons, if you're trying to burn off just a couple more gallons and so on, it makes literally like 0.1% difference in the stall speed of the airplane, so it's no safety difference there. If you're worried about a fire risk, first of all, these planes just don't catch fire anyway. Number 2, what happens is, even if it does catch fire, the difference between 2 gallons and 5 gallons of fuel when you have the fire trucks on standby is negligible. And furthermore, what I don't want somebody to do is try to burn it down to 15 gallons. Turns out the gauges aren't accurate, or when they make their turn to final, that it just uncovers a fuel port and the engine hiccups, and now they have an engine failure on a 2 or 3 mile final, and they end up in a neighborhood. Okay, and they add risk. So just ask them for the intended minimum fuel at touchdown. They give whatever amount they want, and as long as it's not some unreasonable time like 15 minutes or 2 minutes or something like that, we just okay. But then just use some common sense and periodically ask again as we get closer to that intended minimum fuel point. So if they say something like an hour and 20 gallons, and then we ask them for the intended minimum, and they say something like 30 minutes and 10 gallons, okay, fine. Just as we're getting closer to this, ask them again, just quick update, time and amount right now. And if they say, oh, I got 45 minutes and 12 gallons, I'm not sure your math is right there, pilot. You might want to think about going ahead and landing now. Again, not a big deal, just use some common sense. And by the way, when you ask any of these questions, write the answers down, including the Zulu time that they were answered, so that later we can kind of help the pilots with the cross-check. Okay. Flybys. It's not uncommon for pilots to want to do a flyby of the tower, something like that, have tower controllers assess whether the gear is down or down and locked, something like that. The themes are basically just don't add risk and don't be stupid. Tower controllers, no disrespect, but if it's my airplane and I've got the gear problem, you might be able to tell whether the gear is up or down, okay, and distinguish that fairly well. I doubt you can actually really tell whether the gear is down and unlocked versus down and locked. So frankly, for a lot of these flyby situations, I think it's a good idea to call a local FBO, assuming there is one, and see if it's possible just to get a mechanic or two out there by the taxiway just to look at the airplane as it goes by, because they're more qualified than we are to kind of assess what the situation is with the gear. Having said that, as far as the flyby itself, my preference personally is for the flyby to be done at something like 100 feet AGL or higher, and at something like a normal downwind leg speed that they would use on the downwind leg of a VFR traffic pattern. What I want to avoid is anybody doing low-speed flybys and thereby risk a stall. So let's say, for the sake of discussion, somebody's going to do a flyby, and the typical downwind leg speed might be on the order of 90 to 100 knots for some of these slower retractable gear airplanes. Okay, and somebody says, I'm going to slow down and do 60 and so on. That way the mechanic gets a good look at it. No, the mechanic's going to get, or whoever, is going to get a fine look at the gear at the 90 or 100 knots. There is no benefit to slowing down to 60 knots and risking a stall. So just ask them to do the flyby at a floor of about 100 feet or so in a normal downwind leg type speed or higher, and just let us know beforehand what kind of speed they're planning and what kind of floor altitude they're planning. We're not intruding on PIC authority, but I think just plant the bug in the pilot's mind that we're taking risk off the table. Formation flight inspection. I hate these with a passion. So literally, I would like controllers to look at the 7110.65, specifically 10-1-4, which we'll look at in a couple minutes, before you allow any such formation flight if the pilot is at all considering this. Also, just kind of put in the back of your brain something about the Marion Air disaster. And if you don't remember what the Marion Air disaster is, okay, let me just go to google.com, okay, search for Marion Air disaster. Okay, for me it comes up in the autocomplete. I bet if you type it up without having prepped just MERI, it wouldn't surprise me if it comes up Marion Air disaster with the autocomplete. This is a mid-air collision between a Piper Aerostar that turns out had a down and locked nose gear. It's just they didn't know for sure that it was locked. And the pilot of a Bell 412 helicopter said, hey, we'll join up in formation, take a look. Okay, sounds good to us. Well, that was fine until they had a mid-air over an elementary school, so it killed all 5 people on board, including U.S. Senator John Hines and a couple of first-grade girls playing on the school playground, and so on. We are not going to repeat the Marion Air disaster on my watch, if I can paraphrase the Apollo 13 situation. All right, so if pilots are even thinking about doing formation, just warn them, and specifically the way I would do it, this is the way I would do it personally. I would actually pull out the 7110.65 and look at the language of 10-1-4. And here's what it says. So 10-1-4 is about responsibility. E is somewhat pertinent because it's talking about if you're going to do this, don't let them do formation through the clouds. But that's not what we're looking at here. So be aware of that, but I wouldn't particularly note that. Paragraph F says, before determination is made to have an aircraft in distress be escorted by another aircraft, ask the pilots if they are familiar with and capable of formation flight. And I would ask them separately. So I would ask the pilot of airplane A, the one with the gear problem, are you familiar with and capable of formation flight? And assuming the answer is yes, then I would specifically ask the pilot of airplane B, are you familiar with and capable of formation flight? So we have to get yes answers from both of them, because we are not allowed to let them join up in formation during emergency conditions unless they both give yes answers. That's what subparagraph A is. And then subparagraph B says they can communicate with one another and have visual contact with each other. I would go a step further. I don't want to just make sure that they're both on the same frequency and can communicate with one another. What I would recommend strongly is that before they actually join up, that they do communicate directly with one another. And again, if you want to help develop a checklist, some of the suggested things we can do is make sure that they establish with one another Okay, who is going to be responsible for the ultimate closure distance, what their safest closure distance is, what their breakup procedures are in case they lose sight of one another, and so on, and just work through those procedures with one another before we allow them to join up. Because again, I do not want to repeat the Marion Air disaster. Okay, attention, aka pilot distraction. So first of all, just be alert for pilots to be distracted while troubleshooting. You know, they're going to be heads down looking at the pilot's operating handbook, or playing with circuit breakers, or they got to pump a gear handle, you know, 50 times until their arm falls off, whichever comes last, type of a thing. All right, so they might be just a little bit distracted. So just consider granting a block altitude, and in general giving them a wide berth. Just, you know, keep an eye on that. And one of the videos that I have pulled up on the Emergencies Project website under the useful YouTube videos, if I scroll down to, as of the date I'm filming this, the landing gear problem section, one of the incidents I have is from 2016, a Piaggio Avanti. They took off from San Jose, had hydraulic problems. It was clear it was going to affect the main landing gear, so the pilot went south of San Jose and circled for a while. Long story short, you're welcome to watch the video here, but while this guy was circling, trying to troubleshoot the landing gear, okay, he kind of encroached in on the final approach corridor. He had a Southwest 737 coming in from the south on final approach, and tower or approach, I forget who was talking to the pilot specifically, basically said, and I'm going to paraphrase, hey, you're coming up on the final approach corridor, I need to keep that clear. And the pilot's like, all right, I'll make a right turn. Well, it turns out the geometry of that situation, a right turn, put him head on with the Southwest. And so as he starts the right turn, tower or approach is going, no, go left and tighten up your turn. And that's just, all of a sudden we've got risk and so on. Okay, and it worked out just fine as it turns out. I do not want to repeat that kind of problem. So again, just make sure we're clear on where the pilot is going to go. Make sure we give them a wide berth. And for what it's worth, this came up briefly in spring 2019 of recurrent training. I'm just going to pull one slide from the spring 2019 recurrent training. For those of you who remember this was a BE-33 Beechcraft troubleshooting a landing gear problem, and basically they thought he was going to come in and kind of do a flyby type inspection. So at about this point of this video, they were expecting him to turn in on final and do a flyby on the left. You had this airplane cleared to land on the right, and I'm not going to play it, but if you kind of go through and think about what happens, you ended up with suddenly a very close situation. The title of this had to do with startle effect. Okay, in that spring 2019 recurrent training, but they got real close and so on. And then somewhere about in here, Tower was apologizing, saying, he was diagnosing an equipment problem. We were expecting him to turn in and so on. So I'm not going to play it otherwise here. But again, this kind of thing happens, and I suspect that Dublin Air pilot was, again, just distracted troubleshooting and didn't turn in the way we had expected. Just give him a wide berth. Okay, as far as any weird maneuvers that the pilot might make, okay, in an attempt to lower the landing gear, pilots can get a little bit creative here, okay? So I would just request pilots to advise before making any non-standard maneuvers in an attempt to lower the gear. So if they say they're going to do anything with pulling some G's or some tight turns, or they're going to do some slips or skids or otherwise yaw the airplane, I would just like them to describe it to us, and maybe we can come up with some language that would go into this kind of checklist that I'm suggesting. Reminder, if you saw the landing gear overview video, I agree completely in principle with what is written in the Airplane Flying Handbook in Chapter 17. I absolutely disagree with some of the specifics about the maneuvering speed issue with regard to pulling some G's, and I do not like alternating side-to-side movements. I would point you to that video in earnest, but if I just kind of look at it very briefly, in the Airplane Flying Handbook, and I am not going to look at the stuff in Chapter 11, under transition to complex airplanes about retractable landing gear. I'm just going to skip to Chapter 17, the emergency procedures, in the section about landing gear malfunction on page 17-10. If we jump to it, and I've color-coded them, I've highlighted them yellow here. The Airplane Flying Handbook talks about pilots maybe diving the airplane up to basically the red line speed and then pulling a 3G pull. Okay, of course, if you botch the maneuver, then you rip the wings off the airplane. That's how I translate this thing about excessive structural stress. Then you make a bad day, okay? and then they go and explain the reasoning about why it's bad to do it the way the FAA suggests. So I wish this would get changed. I just want pilots to do it slower when they do a pull of presumably no more than about 3 Gs. Same kind of thing with yawing motion, which pilots will sometimes use to help get the main gear down, especially for a lot of airplanes where, and this looks to me like kind of like a Piper Comanche, that main gear is going to come out or go up with a sideways motion. So in this particular example, with that right main gear maybe partially extended, the pilot might want to use rudder with either a slip or a skid type maneuver to try to use the airflow to kind of come in sideways and help pull that gear down, and that can work sometimes. However, the specific way it's written about here is where you're going back and forth in rapid sequence, and then they give the warning right away that please don't do what we're suggesting here. So I'd like to see that change. In principle, I'm fine with kind of doing a slip or a skid, okay, at or below maneuvering speed, just holding rudder off to one side or the other. I do not like this idea of alternating aggressively back and forth. I think that is nuts. But anyway, so until we get our colleagues over at the Flight Standards Division to change the Airplane Flying Handbook, I recommend we please ignore that on our own. So conduct all maneuvers at or below the maneuvering speed for the aircraft at its current weight. As the airplane reduces in weight, the maneuvering speed drops a little bit, and pilots should know that. Also, no alternating side-to-side movements. I hate that idea in the Airplane Flying Handbook. Okay. On rare occasions, you might have pilots who try to bounce the airplane on the runway. That's usually in cases where the main gear is down and there's some problem with the nose gear. Some pilots might come in and they purposely kind of make a firm landing and hope that when they do, it kind of jars the nose gear down or something like that. Actually, I'm kind of okay with that, but I would not want controllers to suggest that. I think if we suggest it to the pilot and the pilot's like, oh, I hadn't thought of that, I'm going to try that, and then they botch it, we're probably on the hook for liability reasons. If the pilot comes up with that idea on their own, okay, I'm fine with it. Just make sure that they know what they're doing. And for me, I would have RF on standby if you're going to have a pilot do any of those bounce maneuvers. If you'd like to hear that, one of the YouTube videos that I've come across that I've put up on the website is this one here from 2017. This was a Japanese-built twin-engine turboprop. Might look loosely like a Saab 2000 if you're not familiar with what a YS-11A is. They had the nose gear stuck up. This is the most relaxed pilot I have ever heard in my life. It's like this is a problem that happens to the nose gear in this airplane every Tuesday or something, right? And this guy actually does some of these touch and go maneuvers where he purposely makes a firm touch and go, hoping to knock the nose gear down. For what it's worth, this guy does as good a job as anybody in doing that, perfectly safe as far as I can tell. It doesn't work, and so the airplane does land with the nose gear up. Okay, but if somebody wants to try that, that's fine. I just have the trucks on standby, but I would not suggest this to the pilots. Let them come up with it on their own. All right, so in summary, I encourage anybody who's interested to help develop a checklist for ATC to use during landing gear troubleshooting events. Okay, and ideally, what we would do is create some such checklist that would also take the form of a form that can go onto the website, and whenever we have one of these landing gear troubleshooting events, somebody could just access it very quickly, download it, and maybe even print it off as needed, and that way we've got the paperwork right there that has all of this stuff written down, only in a better format than what I've come up with already. Reminders about asking for the fuel in both time and amount, the preferred or intended minimum fuel at touchdown, and so on. So, if you're interested, please look at the website, see if one has already been developed or been drafted. Consider making up your own from scratch, submitting it to the website or to me directly, and I will put those up there, and we'll see how this goes as a team-developed checklist that we can use during landing gear troubleshooting events to make sure that we don't add risk to a situation that really should be a nothing burger in the first place. Thank you.